Okay, I'm just going to take a little moment just to show you the built-in EQ that comes with Logic. Very useful, versatile EQ unit, and as you'll see, there's a lot you can do with it. I've just got an audio track here, just imported a final mix of a track. Just going to turn it down a little bit. And we've got a complex mix here, drums, bass. So we're just going to have a look at the EQ. Now, one of the first ways of doing this, if you haven't got any plugins already inserted, is to just double click in this EQ thumbnail box and it will load up an EQ for you. And this is the EQ. Another way of finding it would be to just go straight down to EQ here and go channel EQ. That's the one that's automatically instantiated for you when you double click in the EQ thumbnail. You've got a different choice of lots of different EQs. Channel EQ is the one we use most often. And yeah, again, use your ears. Some of them sound differently, they look differently. This is the fat EQ, it has slightly different controls. It's only a 5-band EQ, whereas the channel EQ is 8 bands, so it's a lot more versatile. Now, say we had a compressor in here and you then thought, actually I want to put an EQ in. If you double click here, it's going to put the EQ after the compressor. Now, a lot of the times I like to use an EQ before compression because compressing will bring up the volume of everything. So if you're compressing something and it's got a lot of bass content that you don't want, for example, it's better to EQ out any frequencies you don't want before you add compression. So rather than having to drag this down, I mean, what we could do is hold the command button, and this defaults to a little hand where you can actually drag the compressor down and then put an EQ before it, because all the processes go top to bottom, so the sound will go through the units top to bottom before it hits the fader. So it does have an important it does matter which order you put your plugins in. But if you've already got 5 or 6 plugins, you don't want to have to move them all. So what you can do is hold the Option key and double click in the EQ, and what that's going to do is add it at the topmost chain. So it's a really useful little shortcut if you suddenly want to EQ the original sound again before you add all your other plugins. So I'm just going to take that compressor out and we're going to have a quick look at this this EQ. So as I said, it's an 8-band EQ, and you can see that these bands up the top, when they're blue they are active, and when they're greyed out they are inactive. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to disable all of them apart from the first 2. Now these first 2 are dedicated filters. We have a high pass filter here, so it lets all the high frequencies pass and filters out the low frequencies. And we have a low pass filter, so we can bracket the sound. So I'm just going to show you the controls for this. Now down at the bottom, this shows you the topmost layer is the actual frequency is working at. You've got the gain or the slope. On the filters, it's a slope function. So if I just drag this up a little bit, you can either drag it by holding on the frequency there, or you can physically grab the curve and move it. Now, the slope is expressed in decibels per octave. Octaves is a certain amount of frequencies, a certain bandwidth of frequencies, and the slope tells you how many decibels the sound goes down by per octave. So at the moment we're going 24 decibels per octave, so we're turning it down quite a lot, but we can up that to 48, which means it's a very savage curve, or you can go down as low as 6, so it's only going down 6 decibels, i.e. half the volume, over the space of an octave. So it's a much more smooth curve. So at the higher slopes you can really bracket it, and I'll show you that in a minute. So if I just turn this off, we just play the mix. I'll play it from where the drums come in. Just going to put this curve in now. Go up to about 24 dBs and start to sweep it up. So this is really useful plugin just to get rid of any low-end rumble on vocal mics, for example. Just before we go, if you look at the thumbnail down here, this accurately gives you a little brief overview as to what EQ curve you're adding. So if we move that up, you'll notice that the thumbnail moves with it. So you can straight away, when you're looking at your mix, if you open the mix window, you can see lots and lots of thumbnails across the top of your mix pane, and you can quickly have a glance as to what EQ curve you've got going on. So if you've got lots of guitar tracks and you can't distinguish between them, and you can see that you've actually got the same EQ curve on lots of tracks at the same time, it will give you a very quick graphic amount of feedback as to what you're actually doing in your mix. So very useful little feature there. If we just go to the low pass filter, we get the opposite kind of effect. So it'll let all the low frequencies pass and cut out the highs. So they're the first two types of EQ we've got there. We've got dedicated high and low pass filters. The next ones in are the shelf EQs. Now what this will do is, at the moment this one's set to 80 Hertz, and what this will do is, instead of a slope now, this is showing you how many decibels of gain you're adding. So what this does is, it adds, if I add 9 decibels of gain, it's going to add 9 decibels from everything from 80 Hertz downwards. Obviously the curve starts slightly in front of 80 Hertz. And similarly with this, we could add or cut 6 dBs of gain from everything from 10k onwards. So you get a radically different sound. So much bassier. And again, we can compare to what we did before. So that's Shelving EQ. And we can double click here and just enter 0 just to quickly go back. And then the next 4 bands, the 4 bands in the middle, are what's called fully parametric. This is where you can change the frequency, the gain, and also the Q factor, or the bandwidth, which is how many frequencies that boost or cut works over. It works basically like a bell-shaped curve. So if I boost at 200 Hertz, you'll see that we've got that characteristic bell-shaped curve. So we can sweep the frequencies up and down. We can add and subtract gain. And we can also change the slope, so we can make it very narrow or very wide. Now, a general rule of thumb is that if you're boosting EQ, a lower Q value, which results in a wider slope, tends to sound better. And if you are cutting, the reverse is true. So cuts tend to sound better if they are narrower. This is just the way our ear works, and I'll show you this now. A quick shortcut to actually, rather than doing all the dragging down here, if you drag in the curve, you can move it left and right and up and down all at the same time. And if you go towards the top of the curve, you'll notice that the cursor changes, and that actually goes to a Q. So what I can now do when I've got the Q up is I can now do the Q as well. So it's very intuitive EQ, so you can quickly grab things, quickly change the Q. Now if I sweep around while it's set to this, you'll notice that it sounds pretty horrible. Watch your mirror. Whereas if I'm cutting at the same time, not so bad. Back to you. Are you still having fun? Now there's more than you can still hear its effect. It sounds more like a phaser pedal, but it's not nearly as intrusive. So if this is really useful if you're finding a resonance on a tom, for example, or a specific frequency in someone's voice that you find objectionable, or any squeaks or pops or thumps. This is really good to be surgically to be able to surgically remove those frequencies. You can use very, very narrow cuts, which is the higher Q values, and they can be very they go all the way up to 100. These Q values, they can be very, very very narrow. Now something else is this gain, this Q gain linking. Now if I set this up so that my Q value, I'm going to zoom in. We can just drag these axes and zoom in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that out so that this curve meets these 2 points on the graph here. And this is to demonstrate the fact that at the moment the curve is not symmetrical. So if I now boost this, we'll notice that it's much wider and that it doesn't meet those graph points. Whereas when I cut it, it does. It meets them here. So this is asymmetric curve Q gain. So this works in your favour really, because of the fact that narrower Qs sound better when you're cutting them. But what you can do is you can turn this off so that when you boost it, it is absolutely symmetrical. Small function, it defaults to be on, and it's most useful in that on state. So you're best off leaving it as it is, because generally speaking, narrow boosts don't sound good. Even that, which isn't that narrow, sounds horrible. So they're the main functions. You've got a master gain stage here where you can turn the whole mix up or down, so we could quickly just add some points here. You'll notice that they're all different colours as well, which is very handy, so you can quickly see which point you're using. So they're all different colours, and when you hover on them you can see the different colours. Now if you like that but it's actually a bit loud, you can turn the whole lot down, or you can turn the whole lot up, and you can again compare to what it was before. Now one of the best features of this EQ, in my opinion, is the analyzer, which gives you a Fourier transform analysis function, for its posh term, which basically gives you a spectrograph, a spectrum analyzer, as to what's actually going on in the frequency content of your track. So if I just go back to the beginning and put the analyzer on, this gives you instant feedback as to the frequency content of the piece. So you can see that there's quite a lot of information at 200 Hertz. You should be able to see exactly where the snare drum is and be able to boost it by looking around this area. So you can see that a lot of the weight of the snare drum was actually happening in this area. So if I was to actually grab a point here, I can accurately find the area for the kick drum, the snare. Now you can also look for the kick drum, and I can see that a lot of the weight for the kick drum is actually happening sub 100 Hertz. And a lot of the bass notes, because they're sustained, are happening around 200 Hertz. If we listen down here, you should hear the kick drum. Obviously they're not isolated because it's complex material, but this is a really useful technique to get used to what frequencies exist in your material and where the instruments are commonly found. You can also see bits of the vocal when the vocals come in. If you look for watching me, if you listen for the all the high frequencies, you'll actually see them peak in this kind of 3 kilohertz area. So if you've got a specific area that you think actually those frequencies are a little bit obnoxious, if I boost them a bit more, you'll really hear them. So you can really hear that TCH there that he's saying. So if they're potentially obnoxious in your mix or in your vocalist, you can turn them down a little bit. So it's a really helpful way of seeing what's going on in your mix. Now you've got a couple of options here as well. Where it says low, this is the resolution as to how many points of frequency you've actually got. I've never felt a need to change this. Resolution high, it just puts more points on the graph if you want to be really accurate. But this one's more important, the post EQ. So the analysis at the moment is after these EQ facts. So for example, if I go back to the beginning and put in a high pass filter, if I play it from the beginning, you'll notice that there's a lot of bass material happening sub 200 Hertz. Now if I fade it up to about 200 Hertz, the display will update itself to not have any of that material in. So this is useful if you have a certain pop or a thump or a frequency that you can feel rather than hear. You can see when it's not there anymore. So it's a really useful way if your speakers don't go low enough, for example, or the headphones you're using aren't that great. You can actually see the thump, or you can see the moment when someone kicks the mic stand, and you can hopefully see when they hit that T note really loud. So you'll be able to get a feedback as to what's actually happening. Now the converse of this is when you have it set to pre-EQ, which means that the display will always show you what's happening on the original track, irrespective of what changes you make. So that always has its uses as well, because it won't take into account any changes you've made. So for example, if you're missing a low fundamental note on your bass, you can actually see it should still be there, and you can see, for example, that your filter is set too high. You can actually see that you've got a lot of material down here that's giving some weight, so we can actually so I can see the kick drum working. So I know I've gone too high. So that's the EQ. It's a very useful tool. Get stuck in. There are presets, again, just like any other thing. I tend to steer clear of them unless it's for something, for a special effect. You've got some EQ tools here, for example, to get a telephone EQ voice and get that kind of megaphone and phone filter frequencies. They're the only ones I've ever found myself using, and that's only to get a special effect. A lot of the ones, for example, voice backing vocals, well, who sang? It depends on who sung it, what register they've sung it in, what type of material they're singing in, whether they're black or white or Hispanic, as to how their voice actually sounds. So any EQ preset has to be taken with a massive bag of salt, because they're not going to work for every person that sings through them. So your ears are the key. If it sounds good, it is good. So have fun with that. Very useful EQ, and hopefully that's demystified it a bit. See you next time.